The bank called me. "Ma'am, a stranger transferred $44 million to your account. Come in urgently." I arrived. The manager closed the door and said, "Ma'am, the sender left you a message." When I read it, my hands started shaking. Good day, dear listeners. It's Anna again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Collins. Most people call me Maggie. I was 52 years old when everything changed, and I want to tell you this story exactly as it happened. No dramatizing, no softening the edges, because the truth, as I learned, is always stranger and more brutal than anything you could invent. I lived in a quiet suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio, in a cream-colored house with green shutters that my late husband Daniel and I had bought in 1998. We raised our son Ethan there, watched him take his first steps on the back porch, sent him off to college from that same front door. Daniel passed away 3 years ago. A massive heart attack, sudden and merciless, the way death so often is. He was 56. He had been a structural engineer his whole career, methodical, precise, the kind of man who kept every receipt and filed every document in color-coded folders in his home office. I loved him for 30 years. His absence left a silence in that house that no amount of routine could fill. After Daniel died, I retired from my position as head librarian at Westfield Public Library and settled into a careful, modest life. I tended my garden. Tomatoes, lavender, a stubborn rose bush Daniel had planted the summer before he got sick. I drove Ethan to the airport when he visited from Denver. I cooked for one and read novels in the evenings and tried, in the way that widows do, to build a life out of what remained. I was not wealthy. Daniel had left a modest life insurance policy and a pension, enough for me to live simply but not extravagantly. I drove a 2017 Honda Accord. I clipped grocery coupons. I did not think about $44 million. I did not even know what $44 million looked like. But some things were beginning to feel wrong. Not dramatically, not in any way I could clearly articulate. Just wrong. The way a room feels wrong when furniture has been slightly moved in the night. The first call came from Robert Collins, Daniel's younger brother, about 6 weeks before the bank called me. Robert and I had never been close. He was the kind of man who entered rooms too loudly and left grudges too quietly, and his wife Sandra was precisely the woman you would expect him to have chosen. Sharp-featured, socially careful, and perpetually calculating something behind her eyes. When Daniel was alive, Robert and Sandra had made a habit of visiting once or twice a year, and every visit had the faint quality of an inspection. They looked at the house, the furniture, Daniel's car. They asked questions that were not quite questions. Robert's call that Tuesday morning was pleasant in tone and hollow in substance. He said he was just checking in. He asked how I was managing. He mentioned casually, almost as an aside, that he'd been reviewing some of Daniel's old business papers and wondered if I'd found anything significant in the home office. I told him I hadn't, which was the truth at the time. He said, "Well, you know Daniel always had a few surprises up his sleeve." He laughed. I did not. 2 weeks after that, I received a letter from Sandra. It was typed, not handwritten, which told me everything I needed to know about its actual purpose. She wrote that she and Robert were concerned about the proper management of family assets following Daniel's passing and suggested we meet with a mediator to discuss what Daniel would have wanted. I read the letter twice at my kitchen table, then set it down next to my coffee cup and sat with it for a long time. Family assets, as though Daniel's life, our life, were a balance sheet to be divided. I called my son Ethan that evening. He was cautious. "Mom, what exactly do they think they're entitled to?" I didn't have an answer. I only knew that the word entitled was exactly the right one. I filed the letter in a drawer and tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself Robert and Sandra were simply being unpleasant in their grief, the way some people are. I told myself it would pass. It did not pass. On a Thursday morning in late October, my phone rang while I was in the garden, pulling dead growth from the rose bush. I recognized the number. It was First Heritage Bank, where Daniel and I had held our joint account for over 2 decades. I wiped my hands on my jeans and answered. "Mrs. Collins?" The voice was formal, measured, the kind of professional calm that only sounds that way when something very serious is happening. "This is Patricia Hale, branch manager at First Heritage Bank on Sycamore Avenue. I need to ask you to come in as soon as possible. There has been a significant transfer of funds into your account, and we need to verify the situation with you directly." "How significant?" I asked. My voice was steadier than I felt. There was a brief pause. $44 million, Mrs. Collins. The transfer was completed this morning. I stood in my garden with dead rose stems in my hand and the autumn sky pressing down gray and close, and I did not speak for what felt like a full minute. $44 million into my account from a stranger. "I'll be there within the hour," I said. I drove to the bank with my hands careful and deliberate on the steering wheel, the way you drive when your mind is somewhere else entirely. The branch on Sycamore Avenue was a building I had entered hundreds of times over the years, to deposit Daniel's paychecks, to take out cash for Christmas shopping, to deal with the estate paperwork after he died. It had always been ordinary and familiar. That morning it felt like a different place altogether. Patricia Hale met me at the door. She shook my hand with the careful grip of a person managing a situation. "Mrs. Collins, thank you for coming so quickly." She led me past the teller windows, past the waiting area with its soft chairs and potted ficus, down a carpeted hallway to a private office at the back of the building. The door was already open. And seated inside, at a small conference table with a leather briefcase open in front of him, was a man I had never seen before in my life. "Mrs. Collins," Patricia said, "this is James Whitfield. He's an estate attorney. He says he's been waiting to speak with you." James Whitfield was in his early 60s, silver-haired with wire-rimmed glasses and the composed expression of a man who had delivered difficult news many times before and knew exactly how to do it. He stood when I entered, extended his hand, and said, "Mrs. Collins, my name is James Whitfield. I was your husband's attorney, and I believe it's time you learned the truth about Daniel." I sat down slowly. Outside the window, the October wind moved through the trees along Sycamore Avenue. I folded my hands on the table and looked at James Whitfield and thought, what truth? What on earth did Daniel keep from me? James Whitfield did not rush. That was the first thing I noticed about him. He spoke with the deliberateness of a man who understood that words, once released, cannot be retrieved. He poured water from a small carafe on the table, placed a glass in front of me, and then opened a manila folder from his briefcase. "Before Daniel passed," he began, "he came to me in the spring of 2018. He asked me to establish an irrevocable trust on his behalf. He was very specific about the terms, very specific about who was to receive the trust's assets and when." I looked at the folder. I looked at his hands, the careful way he held the papers. Why didn't he tell me? The question came out before I could think. Whitfield met my eyes. He was afraid of exactly what I believe is now happening, Mrs. Collins. He was afraid of his brother. He explained it slowly, piece by piece, and I sat in that bank office chair and listened and felt the room rearrange itself around me the way a room does when something fundamental shifts. In the early 1990s, before I met Daniel, before we married, he had been part of a small group of friends who pooled money to invest in a technology startup based out of Columbus. It was informal, a few $1,000s from each of them, the kind of bet young engineers made on long shots. The startup failed initially, restructured, was absorbed by a larger company, and for years the shares sat dormant in a brokerage account that Daniel had almost forgotten. Then, 12 years ago, that larger company went public. The shares multiplied. Daniel quietly, carefully moved the asset into a private trust. The Whitfield-managed Daniel R. Collins Irrevocable Trust, with a single named beneficiary, me. The trust had a specific trigger. It would transfer to me on the 3rd anniversary of Daniel's death, provided no legal challenges to the trust had been successfully completed within that window. 3 years and 1 week ago, Daniel had died. 3 days ago, the trust's anniversary had passed without successful legal challenge. $44 million had arrived in my account that morning. "He didn't tell you," Whitfield said, "because he believed that if Robert knew you were aware of the money, Robert would pressure you directly, manipulate you." Daniel knew his brother. He thought it was safer for you not to know, that your genuine ignorance would be your protection. I stared at the grain of the table for a moment. Your genuine ignorance would be your protection. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of Saturday mornings and shared grocery lists and the specific warmth of sleeping beside the same person for so long that you know every small sound they make. And my husband had carried this secret the entire time. I didn't know whether to feel betrayed or held, protected or deceived. Both, I decided. I felt both. "Robert knew about the trust?" I asked. Robert suspected. Daniel had made the mistake, early on before he came to me, of mentioning the investment to Robert in passing. Not the full amount, not the details, just that he had some old shares that might be worth something someday. Robert apparently never forgot. Whitfield removed another document from his folder. "What we know is this. In the past 3 years, Robert Collins, through an attorney named Gerald Pope, filed 2 separate legal challenges to Daniel's estate, one claiming improper asset disclosure in the original will, one claiming the trust was established under duress. Both challenges were rejected, but the attempts tell us something about his intentions." My hands were flat on the table. I could feel my own pulse in my fingertips. "And now?" I said. "Now that the 3 years have passed and the transfer has happened, what does Robert do now?" Whitfield paused. "He will try again, Mrs. Collins. More aggressively. He already has." Yesterday afternoon, Gerald Pope contacted my office and informed me that Robert Collins intends to file a new civil suit, claiming that Daniel lacked testamentary capacity when the trust was established, and that you exerted undue influence over him. They will argue the trust is fraudulent. I let the silence sit for a moment. Testamentary capacity, undue influence, fraudulent. They were going to argue that I, a school librarian from Cincinnati, had manipulated my engineer husband into hiding $44 million and funneling it to myself. It was almost laughable, but I was not laughing. Outside, on Sycamore Avenue, the wind had picked up. I watched a yellow leaf press itself flat against the window glass and then tear away. What would a person do in this moment? What would I do? Run? Cry? Call Ethan and dissolve? No. Something was hardening in me, something quiet and cold and purposeful. "Mr. Whitfield," I said, "how strong is the trust legally?" "Very strong. Daniel was meticulous. The documentation is thorough. His medical records from that period show no cognitive decline. There are no grounds for a successful challenge unless Robert's attorney can fabricate evidence or locate a witness willing to commit perjury." "And you believe he might try that?" Whitfield took off his glasses, polished them once, replaced them. "I believe Robert Collins is the kind of man who believes that money justifies almost anything. Yes, Mrs. Collins, I believe he might try exactly that." I drove home from that bank meeting in a different kind of silence than the one I'd driven there in. This silence was not confusion, it was something being built. I sat at Daniel's desk in his home office that evening, surrounded by his color-coded folders, and I thought about Robert's call 6 weeks ago. Always had a few surprises up his sleeve, and the cold calculation behind Sandra's typed letter. They had been circling this for 3 years. They had filed 2 lawsuits and failed. Now they were going to try to paint me as a manipulative woman who had stolen from her own husband. I thought of everything I stood to lose, not just the money, though $44 million was not nothing even to a woman who had just learned it existed. I thought about my reputation, about what a public lawsuit would do to my name in this community, to Ethan's name, to Daniel's memory, about the possibility of hostile attorneys and deposition rooms and years of grinding legal warfare designed to exhaust me into surrender. And then I thought, what would Daniel want me to do? He had hidden the trust for 3 years to protect me. He had chosen James Whitfield. He had been meticulous. He had built something careful and solid, and he had left it for me. Not for Robert, not for Sandra. For me. I was not going to surrender it. I opened my laptop at Daniel's desk and began writing notes. I wrote down everything Whitfield had told me, every name, every date, every detail. I wrote down Robert's call, Sandra's letter. I thought about what I needed, not emotionally, but practically. I needed my own attorney, completely separate from Whitfield, someone who specialized in contested estates and civil litigation. I needed a private record of every communication Robert and Sandra had sent me. I needed to understand exactly what Gerald Pope's legal strategy would look like and prepare for it point by point. I needed, above all, to be 3 steps ahead. I wrote 2 words at the top of the page and underlined them. Document everything. The plan was beginning to take shape. It was not dramatic. It was not born of rage. It was quiet and systematic, which, I was beginning to understand, was the only way to win the kind of war that Robert Collins wanted to start. The next morning, I called Ethan before 8 o'clock. It was 6 in the morning for him in Denver, and his voice was thick with sleep when he answered, but it sharpened fast as I talked. I told him everything. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold beside me, and I walked him through it. Whitfield, the trust, the $44 million, Robert's 2 failed lawsuits, the new threat. There was a long silence when I finished. "Mom," he said carefully, "are you okay?" "I'm fine, Ethan. I need to be practical right now." Another silence. Then, "What do you need from me?" That was my son. Not "are you sure?" Or maybe Robert has a point, or "this is overwhelming." Just, "What do you need?" I loved him fiercely in that moment. "I need the name of a good litigation attorney," I said. "Someone who handles contested estates, and I need you to know what's happening in case Robert or Sandra try to contact you." Ethan gave me 2 names before we hung up. Attorneys he'd found through colleagues in Denver who had dealt with complex estate litigation. I wrote both names down and began making calls that same morning. By that afternoon, I was seated in the downtown Cincinnati office of attorney Catherine Marsh. Catherine Marsh was 50 years old, lean and direct, with close-cropped dark hair and an office that was deliberately sparse. No decorative clutter, just files, a legal library, and 2 small framed photographs on her desk that I did not ask about. She'd spent 22 years handling contested estates and inheritance litigation, and she had the specific, quiet confidence of someone who has won enough hard cases to know the difference between a difficult situation and a lost one. I walked her through everything. She listened without interrupting, taking precise notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me. "Mrs. Collins, the trust, as Whitfield has structured it, is solid. The 2 prior challenges failing is actually helpful. It establishes a pattern of bad faith litigation on Robert's part. If he files a 3rd suit with the same core argument, a judge is going to notice." "He's changing the argument," I said. "Testamentary capacity and undue influence this time." "That's harder to prove, but it's also more easily defended. We have Daniel's medical records. We have the timeline showing the trust was established 7 years before his death, when he was in perfect health. Undue influence requires evidence that you dominated or controlled him. From what you've described, the opposite was true." She looked at me levelly. "You had no idea the money existed." "No, I didn't." "Then that's actually your strongest asset, paradoxically. You can't have manipulated a man into hiding money you didn't know about." She tapped her pen on the legal pad. "Here's what I want you to do. I want every communication you've received from Robert Collins or Sandra Collins since Daniel's death. Phone records if you have them, every letter, every email, every text message. I want dates and approximate content of any verbal conversations, and I want you to stop communicating with them entirely from this point forward. Everything goes through me." I nodded. "There's something else," I said. I told her about Sandra's typed letter. I had brought it with me in a plastic sleeve. The way you protect something you understand is evidence before you even fully understand why. Catherine took it by its edges, read it again. "Family assets," she said quietly. "That phrase will be useful." I drove home from Catherine's office with a different kind of steadiness than I had driven anywhere in days. Something was being structured now, something with form and edges. What I did not anticipate was what happened 3 days later. I came home from the grocery store on a Friday afternoon to find a voicemail on my landline. I still had one. Daniel's habit, something I'd never changed. From a number I didn't recognize. The message was from a man who identified himself as Howard Pell, a former colleague of Daniel's from the early 1990s. His voice was hesitant. He said he had heard through mutual acquaintances that there was some legal activity around Daniel's estate. He said he needed to speak with me. He said he had information he thought I should know. I stood in my kitchen with grocery bags still in my hands and listened to the message twice. Then I called Catherine Marsh. "Don't call him back yourself," she said immediately. "Give me the number. I'll have my associate reach out first and find out who this man is and what he has." It took 48 hours. When Catherine called me back, her voice had changed. Not dramatically, but in the way that voices change when the information behind them is significant. "Howard Pell was one of the original investors in the 1990s startup," she said. "He says that approximately 8 months ago, he was contacted by Gerald Pope, Robert's attorney, and asked to provide a sworn statement that Daniel had, at the time of the investment, expressed confusion and uncertainty about the nature of what he was signing. Pope wanted Pell to say that Daniel didn't fully understand the investment contract. I sat down. That would support the testamentary capacity argument. Exactly. And here's the critical piece. Pell says he refused. He says Daniel was sharp as a nail at the time, and he wouldn't lie under oath. But he also says Pope didn't take no gracefully. Pope called him 3 more times over the following 2 months. The calls became pressuring. Pell found them frightening enough that he kept notes. The room was very quiet around me. He kept notes, I repeated. Dated, detailed notes of each conversation. He saved Pope's voicemails. Catherine paused. Mrs. Collins, if what Howard Pell is describing is accurate, Gerald Pope has been attempting to suborn perjury in preparation for a fraudulent civil suit. That is not just aggressive lawyering. That is potentially criminal conduct. I looked out my kitchen window at the rose bush in the backyard, the one Daniel had planted. What did you know, Daniel? I thought. How far were you certain they would go? What do we do with this? I asked. We document it, Catherine said, carefully and completely. And then we decide when and how to use it. Because this, Mrs. Collins, this is a weapon, and you don't reveal a weapon until the moment it does the most damage. I understood. Robert and Sandra had spent 3 years constructing their case. They were not going to expect that I had spent 3 weeks building mine. The distance between us had just collapsed considerably. Catherine moved methodically, the way I was beginning to understand she did everything. Over the following 2 weeks, she met with Howard Pell in person and had his testimony recorded in a formal affidavit. Each date, each call from Gerald Pope, each attempt to pressure him into a false statement. Pell was 64 years old, recently retired, and critically frightened enough of what Pope had done to be genuinely willing to testify. His voicemail recordings were sent to a digital forensics firm for authentication. Every document Whitfield had prepared for the original trust was reviewed and cataloged. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning in November, Catherine filed a preemptive motion in Hamilton County Common Pleas Court. The motion did 3 things simultaneously. It formally established and documented the trust and its lawful transfer to me. It included Howard Pell's affidavit in full, along with the authenticated voicemail recordings of Gerald Pope's pressure campaign. And it requested that the court compel Gerald Pope and Robert Collins to respond to formal interrogatories before any new civil suit was filed, essentially forcing them to answer under oath whether they had attempted to manufacture witness testimony. It was a preemptive strike, the kind you make when you know the other side is loading their weapon and you can prove it before they fire. Catherine called me when the filing was complete. It's done, she said. They'll know within 24 hours. They knew within 6. Robert called my cell phone that evening at 7:15. I had already told Catherine to expect it, and I had already decided exactly what I would do. I let it ring. I watched his name on my screen, Robert Collins, and I let it ring until voicemail picked up. He did not leave a message. Sandra called from her own phone 11 minutes later. I let that ring too. At 8:40, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Robert standing on my front porch with his coat collar up against the November cold. He looked different than the last time I'd seen him, at Daniel's funeral. Older, harder, with a tightness around his jaw that I recognized as controlled anger. Sandra was not with him. He had come alone. I called Catherine. "Robert is at my door," I said quietly. "Don't open it," she said without hesitation. "Don't speak to him. If he doesn't leave in 5 minutes, call the non-emergency police line and ask for a welfare check. That'll get an officer there without escalating." I stood in my hallway in the dark and listened to my brother-in-law ring my doorbell twice more. Then he knocked, hard and deliberate. Then he said, loudly enough that I could hear it clearly through the door, "Maggie, I know you're in there. This is a mistake. What you're doing. You don't understand what you're starting." I said nothing. "Maggie." His voice shifted, softer, almost conciliatory, the tone of someone who has practiced this. "We're family. Daniel would not have wanted this. You know that." Family. The word he used when he wanted something. Not when he called to check on me in the year after Daniel died. Not when he missed every one of Ethan's birthdays. Family now when there was money on the table. He stood on my porch for 11 minutes. I timed it. Then I heard his footsteps cross the wooden boards, heard his car door, heard him drive away. The next morning, Catherine received a call from Gerald Pope. She relayed it to me that afternoon, her voice carefully neutral. Pope is threatening to countersue, claiming our preemptive motion is harassment and defamation. He's also threatening to report Whitfield to the Ohio bar on the grounds that the trust was improperly structured. She paused. He made one additional comment. He said that if you don't withdraw the motion and agree to mediation on Robert's terms within 72 hours, they will contact local media and suggest that you are a woman who married Daniel under false pretenses and spent 30 years concealing his assets from his family. The silence stretched between us. "That's blackmail," I said. "It's not legally precise enough to prosecute as blackmail," Catherine said carefully, "but it's close enough to matter. He's betting that the threat of public scandal will frighten you into settling." I thought about that for a long moment. I thought about what it would mean. My name in the local paper, the whispers in the grocery store, the looks from people who had known Daniel and me for 30 years. I thought about Ethan seeing his mother's name in a headline about fraud. And then I thought, they have nothing real. They are threatening me with smoke. "Tell Mr. Pope," I said slowly, "that we will not be withdrawing the motion. And tell him that if one word of this goes to the media, we will immediately escalate the perjury suborning evidence to the Ohio Attorney General's office. A full criminal referral. Gerald Pope's law license will be the first casualty." There was a brief silence on Catherine's end. Then she said, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has won a few things in her life, "I'll deliver that exactly as stated." Pope did not call back that day. Robert did not appear at my door again. The 72-hour deadline passed in silence. I understood that they had not retreated. They had paused. They were regrouping. The quiet after a threat like that is not peace. It's the breath before a different kind of attack. But I was tired. Not defeated. Tired in the way you are after you have held yourself rigid against something for weeks and it has finally, temporarily, stopped pushing. I called Ethan. I called my oldest friend, Diane, who lived 2 streets over and who had sat with me the night Daniel died and who knew me better than almost anyone. I told them both I needed a few days. I spent those days slowly. I cooked real meals. I walked in the November cold. I sat in Daniel's chair in the living room and read a novel from beginning to end without stopping to think about trusts and affidavits and men who knocked on my door in the dark. I let myself grieve a little, not just what was happening now, but Daniel, properly, for the first time in weeks. The secret he had kept, the faith it represented. He had built something for me, and I was going to keep it. The offer came on a Monday, 10 days after the standoff. It arrived not through Pope this time, but through a neutral third party, a financial mediator named Douglas Carey, who called Catherine's office and requested a meeting on behalf of Robert Collins. Catherine told me about it over coffee at a cafe near her office, the kind of detail-forward briefing I had come to expect from her. "Robert is proposing a settlement," she said. "He is willing to drop all current and future legal challenges to the trust in exchange for a one-time payment from you of $11 million, framed as a voluntary family recognition gift." I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and looked at the window. It was raining outside, a thin, cold November rain that made the street look silver. $11 million, I said. $11 million. Catherine watched me. "He's framing it as generosity on his part, as though he's doing you a favor by only asking for a quarter of it." I understood exactly what this was. It was the velvet hand after the iron fist. They had tried to frighten me with a confrontation on my porch, with the threat of media exposure, with the ultimatum, and none of it had worked. Now they were trying the other approach, making the money feel like a burden I would gladly share to make the whole thing go away. $11 million to buy peace. $11 million to end the phone calls and the threats and the long, grinding anxiety of litigation. Was I tempted? I want to be honest with you. For approximately 30 seconds, yes, 30 seconds of sitting in that cafe and thinking it would just be over. 30 seconds of imagining the silence that would follow. And then I thought of Daniel's face the summer before he died, when we were sitting on the back porch and he looked out at the rose bush and said quietly, for no particular reason, "I want you to be all right, Maggie. After." I hadn't understood what he meant then. I understood it now. He had spent years making careful arrangements so that I would be all right, so that Robert Collins would not be able to take what was mine. If I handed Robert $11 million to stop fighting, I would not be honoring Daniel's work. I would be proving to Robert that threats and pressure were effective, which meant he would use them again and again, because $11 million would become the floor, not the ceiling. "No," I said to Catherine. "We don't negotiate with this." She nodded once, as if she had expected nothing less. "I'll inform Douglas Carey." The rejection of the offer produced a new kind of silence from Robert's side, the silence of a man recalculating. Catherine warned me to be watchful. These quiet periods, she said, were often when the most serious moves were prepared. In the meantime, I leaned into the people who were holding me up. Diane Reardon had been my friend since 1989, the year Daniel and I moved into the neighborhood, and she appeared at our door with a casserole and an offer to help with boxes. She was 60 now, retired, twice divorced, and constitutionally incapable of patience with nonsense. When I finally sat down and told her the full story, in her living room over 2 glasses of wine, while her old cat circled the couch, she listened with her hands folded and her eyes sharp. And when I finished, she said, "These people are parasites, Maggie. You're doing exactly the right thing. Don't you dare flinch." It was not complicated advice, but it was the advice I needed. Ethan flew in from Denver the following weekend, booked the ticket without my asking, simply appeared at the airport and texted me to come get him. We spent 3 days together in the house he'd grown up in, cooking, watching old movies, talking about Daniel in the way we hadn't allowed ourselves since the funeral. He looked at me across the dinner table on the second night and said, "Dad knew what he was doing, Mom. He knew you would handle this." "You think so?" "He knew you better than you knew yourself sometimes." Ethan smiled, a little sad at the edges. He always said you were the most quietly stubborn person he'd ever met. I held that thought for a long time. There was one more piece of support that surprised me. James Whitfield, the estate attorney who had managed the trust, called me the week after I declined the settlement. He said that over the course of his career he had seen many contested inheritances, and that he wanted me to know he had never prepared a trust with more deliberate, documented care than Daniel had insisted upon for mine. "Your husband," he said, "sat in my office for 6 hours the day we finalized the documents. He read every paragraph. He asked every question. He was preparing for exactly this." I thanked him. When I hung up, I stood in the hallway for a moment and let myself feel, very quietly and completely, how much Daniel had loved me. Then I straightened up and went back to work, because Robert was not finished. I was certain of it. The calm was not the end. The calm was the approach of something else. I was right. They came on a Sunday. I remember the day clearly. First Sunday of December, the sky the specific dull white of a Midwestern winter morning, Christmas lights already up on the houses along the street. I was making oatmeal when I heard a car pull into the driveway, and when I looked through the kitchen window, I saw Robert and Sandra together, walking toward my front door with the careful, deliberate pace of people who have rehearsed this. Robert was wearing a tie. Sandra was carrying a foil-covered dish. I stood very still in my kitchen for a moment and thought, Of course they are doing this. I called Catherine immediately. She didn't answer. It was Sunday morning, so I left a voicemail. "Robert and Sandra are here. I'm going to hear what they have to say. I won't agree to anything." Then I put the phone in my cardigan pocket and opened the door. Maggie. Robert's voice was soft, remorseful. He had practiced this thoroughly. "We owe you an apology." Sandra extended the foil dish. "I made a roast chicken, the way Daniel used to like it." Her voice caught, just slightly, on Daniel's name. Just enough. I looked at them. Robert in his tie, Sandra with the dish, both of them standing in the cold on my porch, with their faces arranged into expressions of sorrow and peace. And I stepped back and let them in, because refusing entry would tell them I was afraid, and I was not going to give them that. We sat in the living room. I did not offer coffee. I sat in Daniel's armchair across from them, hands in my lap, and waited. Robert spoke first. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking since that unfortunate business with the attorney. He said the past weeks had shown him how badly things had gotten off track. He said the money had made them all lose perspective, and that family, real family, was more important than any sum. He used Daniel's name 3 times in the first 2 minutes. He spoke about the early years, when he and Daniel were boys, when their father was still alive. He was very good. If I had not known what I knew, I might have believed him. Then he got to it. "Maggie, Sandra, and I have been thinking. We don't want the money. We never really wanted the money." A pause. The calibrated pause of a man who has said this sentence before. What we wanted was to feel connected to Daniel's legacy, to feel like we were still part of the family, and we understand if you felt threatened by our attorney's approach. That was wrong of us. Sandra leaned forward. What if we found a way to honor Daniel together? A scholarship fund, perhaps. Something with his name on it. You could manage it however you wanted. We just want to be part of it. She smiled, gentle and wounded. That's all. Just to be part of something that keeps Daniel's memory alive. I looked at them both. A scholarship fund. I would set one up with Daniel's money, put his brother's name in the acknowledgments, and in exchange, Robert and Sandra would do what exactly? They had said nothing about withdrawing the legal threats. They had said nothing about Gerald Pope and the suborned perjury. They had said nothing about the $11 million demand. They were offering me the feeling of generosity in exchange for nothing at all. "Robert," I said, "I want to ask you something directly." I kept my voice level, pleasant even. "Did Gerald Pope advise you to visit me today?" A flicker, just the smallest one, in the corner of Robert's left eye. Then his expression resettled. "This isn't about attorneys, Maggie. This is about family." "Did he advise that a personal visit from you and Sandra might be effective after the settlement offer was declined?" Sandra set down her coffee cup. She had poured herself one without being invited, I noticed. "Maggie, we're not here to negotiate." "You absolutely are," I said, quietly, without raising my voice by a single degree. "You're here because every formal strategy you've tried has failed, and you're hoping that Sandra's chicken and Robert's memories of his childhood will succeed where the lawyers couldn't." I looked at Sandra. It was a well-chosen detail, by the way. Daniel's favorite recipe. I almost want to know how you landed on that. The room changed. Not dramatically. No one shouted, no one stood up. But the performance dissolved. Robert's face lost its arranged sorrow and became what it actually was, calculating, tight, frustrated. "You're making a mistake," he said. His voice was different now. The rehearsed warmth was gone completely. "You don't know what you're doing, Maggie. You've been isolated by that attorney. You've let a stranger convince you to cut yourself off from the only family Daniel had left. When this goes to court, and it will go to court, the judge is going to see a woman who refused every reasonable offer, who weaponized an old man's discomfort." "Howard Pell is 64, I said, and he was not uncomfortable. He was being pressured into perjury." Silence. "We're done today," I said. I stood up. "I would like you to leave. Sandra, you can take the chicken. I won't be eating it." Robert stood slowly. His jaw was rigid. For a moment, he looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw in his eyes the thing I had suspected was always there, the belief that I was a soft obstacle, a librarian, a widow, someone who could be managed. "You'll regret this," he said. "Perhaps," I said. "Please leave." They left. Sandra carried the chicken. Robert did not look back. I closed the door and stood in the hallway, and for the first time since this had all begun, I felt genuinely afraid. Not the anxious wariness of the past weeks, something more visceral, because the mask was fully off now. They were not going to stop. They had tried intimidation, blackmail, legal pressure, financial temptation, and emotional manipulation, and I had refused all of it. And the look in Robert's eyes when he left told me that the next move would be the most serious one yet. But fear, I was discovering, is not always the opposite of strength. Sometimes it is the fuel. I went back to Daniel's desk and called Catherine's cell phone directly. She answered on the second ring. "They came," I said. "It didn't go the way they planned. We need to be ready. Robert is going to escalate." "I know," she said. "I've been preparing for that. Can you come to the office tomorrow morning?" "Yes," I said. 7 o'clock. I'll bring everything." Robert filed his suit on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December. The complaint was 47 pages long. I read every page at my kitchen table, slowly, with a yellow highlighter. The claim was precisely what Whitfield had predicted: testamentary incapacity, undue influence, fraudulent concealment. It was built on a single affidavit from a retired accountant named Vincent Cayley, who claimed to have witnessed Daniel in a state of significant cognitive confusion in the spring of 2018, the very period during which the trust had been established. I had never heard that name in 30 years of Daniel's life. Neither had Ethan. By noon the same day, Catherine's investigator had the answer. Vincent Cayley was a retired accountant from Dayton who'd been a fraternal lodge brother of Gerald Pope's father. He had no documented connection to Daniel Collins at any point in his life. His affidavit claimed he had encountered Daniel at a Columbus business conference in March 2018 and found him visibly distressed and confused, an encounter for which there was no registration record, no hotel booking, no other witness, and no documentation of any kind. It was manufactured, a fabricated witness, inserted into a sworn legal filing. They fabricated a witness, I said. Yes, Catherine said, and we take it to the judge first. We let them walk into that courtroom believing their witness is solid. Then we dismantle it in front of everyone. The hearing was on December 19th. I wore dark navy. Catherine wore charcoal gray. We arrived 15 minutes early. Robert and Sandra came with Gerald Pope, who moved with the brisk confidence of a man who believes the outcome is already decided. He saw me across the hallway. I held his gaze without expression and looked away. Judge Patricia Okafor called the session to order at 9:15. Pope presented his case smoothly. Daniel's alleged cognitive decline, undue influence, Vincent Cayley's affidavit. He was polished and certain. Then Catherine stood up. She began with Howard Pell, the documented pressure campaign, the authenticated voicemails, Pope's calls requesting false testimony. Then she turned to Vincent Cayley. She presented the investigators' findings. No documentation placing Cayley in Columbus in March 2018, no conference registration, the 30-year lodge connection between Cayley and Pope's family, a formal affidavit from the Columbus Convention Center confirming no such conference had taken place. Opposing counsel, Catherine said, has committed fraud upon this court. This proceeding is built on a fabricated witness, following a documented prior campaign to solicit perjury from another witness who refused. The silence in the courtroom was complete. Judge Okafor looked at her documents. Then she looked at Pope. Mr. Pope, can you produce any documentation placing Vincent Cayley in Columbus in March of 2018? A pause. 5 seconds. Your Honor, we would need additional time to... A yes or no answer will suffice. Behind Pope, Robert Collins put both hands flat on his knees and looked at the floor. The gesture of a man watching what he built topple. No, Pope said. Not at this time. This hearing is suspended pending formal review of opposing counsel's conduct, Judge Okafor said. I am referring this matter to the Ohio Supreme Court's Board of Professional Conduct and issuing a protective order in favor of Mrs. Collins for the duration. She looked directly at Robert. Mr. Collins, do you understand what I am telling you? Yes, Your Honor, he said. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and felt nothing theatrical. No triumph, no rage. Only the deep, settled satisfaction of a woman who had done the work and let it speak for itself. The weeks after the hearing moved with the systematic logic of consequence, catching up with action. Gerald Pope's law license was suspended for 3 years pending criminal review, after the Board of Professional Conduct found he had materially assisted in fabricating sworn testimony and had attempted to suborn perjury from Howard Pell. Vincent Cayley entered a deferred prosecution agreement, admitted to providing a knowingly false statement, and was placed on 2 years probation. The civil suit was dismissed with prejudice. Robert could never bring the same claim again, and he was ordered to pay both sides' attorney fees from the moment the fabricated witness was introduced. Robert himself pled guilty to a single felony count of filing a fraudulent instrument, 18 months probation, a substantial fine, and a permanent civil judgment barring him from contesting Daniel's estate in any form. On the day he entered his plea, I was not in the courtroom. I had done what needed to be done. I did not need to watch the ending. What I did, instead, was meet with Whitfield and Catherine at his office, the same room where he had first explained Daniel's trust to me. Winter sun came through the tall windows. We sat at the conference table and discussed what to do with what Daniel had left me. I established the Daniel R. Collins Memorial Scholarship Fund at the University of Cincinnati School of Engineering, his alma mater, with an endowment of $3 million, funding 10 full scholarships annually for first-generation engineering students. Daniel had been the first in his family to attend university. It seemed right. I paid off the house. I paid Ethan's remaining student loans without being asked. I hired a fee-only financial advisor and invested the rest conservatively. Daniel would have approved. Sandra sent a typed letter 6 weeks after Robert's plea. She said she hoped I could find it in my heart, in time. I read it at my kitchen table, thought about it, and filed it away, not in the trash, in a folder. Because preservation, I had learned, is more useful than reaction. In March, Catherine sent me the final court order with a handwritten note. "Congratulations, Maggie. Daniel chose well." I put it in Daniel's color-coded filing system. It felt like a conversation continuing. I was 52 when the bank called. I was 53 when the last document was filed. 12 months, the longest year of my life, and the most clarifying. I did not become a different person. I was still the woman who clipped coupons and talked to the rose bush and cooked too much food. What changed was not who I was. What changed was what I knew about who I was. Quietly stubborn, my son had said. Daniel had known it long before I did. The spring that followed was the most ordinary spring of my life, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. I replanted the garden properly. I joined the board of a women's financial literacy nonprofit. I found a therapist. I say this plainly without apology, because the year had been traumatic in ways I hadn't fully registered while living through it. I drove to Denver to see Ethan, hiked Red Rocks with him, and stood at the top looking out at the vast western distance, feeling, without drama, complete. By summer, I was, in the specific and unshowy way, genuinely all right. Robert and Sandra's lives moved in a different direction. The felony conviction cost Robert his job of 19 years. Sandra's social world, built on respectability and the currency of being Daniel's sister-in-law, contracted sharply. They relocated to a smaller city in Indiana the following autumn, a fresh start of the kind that comes after consequences rather than before. The scholarship fund made its first awards that fall. 10 first-generation engineering